The rhythmic heavy beat of rain on rusted metal was the only sound in the shipping yard, until the sickening thud of a boot hitting Han Mi-Seon's side echoed through the containers. She collapsed into the freezing mud, her fingers clawing at the gravel as she tried to shield her swollen abdomen from the surrounding circle of armed men. Standing over her was Seo Kang-Ryeon, the man they called the Glacier of Seoul, his $5,000 Italian wool coat untouched by the grime. He looked down with eyes that had long ago traded humanity for cold, hard discipline, seeing only a package to be delivered to a rival broker. He had no idea that the trembling woman at his feet, who had spent months fleeing through the dark corners of the city, was about to shatter the one rule he built his empire on: never get involved. As Mi-Seon's bloodied hand reached out to grasp the hem of his coat, her voice a ragged whisper begging for her unborn child's life, something in Kang-Ryeon's chest, a heart he thought was dead, cracked. He didn't see a target anymore, he saw a mirror of the innocence he had once failed to protect. When he slowly raised his weapon, not toward the woman, but toward his own loyal enforcers, the air in the shipping yard turned lethal. He wasn't just breaking a rule, he was declaring a war that would burn his entire underworld empire to the ground in less than 24 hours. Before I begin, I want to use this medium to wish you compliments of the season. Kindly comment where you are watching from and also support the channel by clicking the subscribe button to subscribe. Thank you. The story of Kang-Ryeon and Mi-Seon is a collision between a world of calculated cruelty and a mother's desperate hope. For 20 years, Seo Kang-Ryeon had survived the Seoul underworld by adhering to a singular, blood-stained philosophy: emotion is a liability that gets you killed. He rose to power by burying his feelings alongside his enemies, becoming a man of sharp suits and sharper instincts who ruled through absolute neutrality. But Han Mi-Seon was the one variable he couldn't calculate. A woman of quiet strength who had been hunted by the ruthless Mi-Seon, she carried a secret that the criminal underworld viewed as nothing more than leverage. While Seon saw an unborn child as a bargaining chip, Kang-Ryeon's unexpected hesitation at the dock signaled a tectonic shift in his soul. Despite his fearsome reputation, he chose to bring the liability into his inner sanctum, forcing the cynical Dr. Lim Wajin to risk his life for a cause that didn't pay in gold. In the safe house, amidst the sound of sharpening blades and the frantic prep of medical equipment, a new version of Kang-Ryeon began to emerge. As the rival syndicate mobilized their assassins to reclaim their commodity, they didn't realize that the man they once feared for his logic was now 10 times more dangerous, because he finally had something worth losing. The morning sun over Seoul was nothing more than a pale, gray smudge behind the curtain of smog and relentless drizzle, mirroring the cold sterility of Seo Kang-Ryeon's high-rise office. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of expensive espresso and the unspoken terror of the 3 men standing before his desk. Kang-Ryeon didn't look up from the tablet in front of him. His silence was his most effective weapon, it allowed the imagination of his subordinates to do the work of a torture rack. He was a man of absolute geometry, his suit was perfectly tailored, his hair swept back without a single stray strand, and his logic was as sharp as the glass desk he worked upon. For a decade, his iron rule had been the bedrock of his syndicate: every action must yield a profit, every emotion must be purged. The broker, Mi-Seon, has increased the bounty, Baek Jun-il reported, his voice steady despite the tension. He placed a dossier on the desk, the cover stained with a single drop of rain. 300 million won for the woman. 500 if she's delivered before the weekend. Seon is calling it a recovery of lost assets. Kang-Ryeon finally looked up, his eyes 2 chips of obsidian that seemed to calculate the soul's worth in currency. A recovery? He asked, his voice a low, melodic rasp. She is a pregnant woman, Jun-il. Not a shipment of gold bars. To Seon, there is no difference, the enforcer replied. The father was a whistleblower. The child she carries is the only key to the encrypted accounts he left behind. Seon wants the key before it's born and the codes are lost. Kang-Ryeon leaned back, the leather of his chair creaking softly. To him, Han Mi-Seon was merely a variable in a larger equation of power. He felt no pity for her flight through the city's underbelly, nor for the life growing inside her. To feel was to fail. He saw only a strategic opportunity to consolidate his influence over the rival brokers. If he found her first, he held the leverage. If she died in the process, the accounts died with her, and the market remained stable. It was clean. It was efficient. Find her by dusk, Kang-Ryeon commanded, his tone as final as a gavel. Locate the clinic where she's hiding. If she resists, remind her that in this city, even mercy has a price tag she cannot afford. We are not hunters, Jun-il. We are debt collectors. And it is time for her to pay. As Jun-il bowed and retreated, Kang-Ryeon turned his gaze back to the window. He watched the rain wash over the glass, oblivious to the fact that the woman he had just ordered to be hunted was currently shivering in a nearby alley, clutching a stomach that had begun to tighten with the first, terrifying cramps of a premature labor. The iron rule was set, the bounty was live, and the package was already breaking. The sky over the Incheon shipping docks didn't just rain, it wept a torrential, blinding deluge that turned the industrial wasteland into a maze of slick steel and deep shadows. Seo Kang-Ryeon stood motionless under a black umbrella held by a trembling junior associate, his eyes fixed on the rusted hull of a freighter. The extraction was supposed to be a surgical strike, quiet, efficient, and bloodless. But as the sound of splintering wood and a feminine scream cut through the roar of the storm, the air turned electric with the scent of ozone and imminent violence. Baek Jun-il emerged from the shadow of a stack of containers, dragging a woman by the arm. Mi-Seon looked like a ghost haunting the pier, her dress was plastered to her frame, her face a mask of exhaustion and terror. As they reached the center of the clearing, her knees gave out. She collapsed into a pool of oily water, her breath coming in ragged, hitching gasps. She tried to run through the maintenance tunnels, Jun-il reported, his voice tight. She's injured, boss. I think the fall triggered something. Kang-Ryeon stepped forward, the heels of his polished boots clicking against the concrete like a countdown. He looked down at her, his face an unreadable mask of stone. Behind him, his men shifted restlessly, their hands hovering over their holsters. This was the moment of the iron rule, she was the asset, the key to the encrypted accounts, and the rival broker was already waiting at the perimeter to take delivery. Get her up, Kang-Ryeon commanded, his voice devoid of warmth. But as Jun-il reached for her, Mi-Seon didn't pull away. Instead, she lunged forward, her muddy, trembling fingers locking onto the hem of Kang-Ryeon's coat. The contact was a violation of every protocol he had ever established. His men froze, expecting him to recoil or strike her. Please, she rasped, her voice barely audible over the thunder. She looked up, and for the first time, Kang-Ryeon saw the raw, primal ferocity of a mother. She wasn't looking at him as a mob boss, she was looking at him as a last resort. I don't care what you do to me. Kill me, give me to them, but please, save my baby. She let out a low, guttural moan of agony, her body racking with a contraction that made her double over in the mud. In that moment, the asset vanished. Kang-Ryeon saw not a bargaining chip, but a dying flame. The silence that followed was deafening. Jun-il looked at his boss, waiting for the signal to hand her over to Seon's waiting transport. Instead, Kang-Ryeon did the unthinkable. He reached down, his large, gloved hand closing around Mi-Seon's wrist, not to pull her away, but to steady her. Change of plans, Kang-Ryeon said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register. Boss? Jun-il stammered, his eyes widening. The broker is 5 minutes away. The rule. The rule is dead, Kang-Ryeon snapped, turning his gaze toward the perimeter where the rival headlights were appearing. He swept Mi-Seon up into his arms, her weight startlingly light against his chest. Tell Seon the deal is off. If he wants her, he'll have to walk through me to get her. The black armored sedan tore through the rain-slicked streets of Seoul, its tires screaming against the pavement as Seo Kang-Ryeon held the shivering woman against his chest. He could feel the erratic, frantic heat radiating from Han Mi-Seon's body, a stark contrast to the chilled leather of the interior. Beside him, Baek Jun-il gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned a ghostly white, his eyes darting repeatedly to the rearview mirror. He wasn't just looking for the headlights of the rival broker's hunters, he was looking at a boss he no longer recognized. "Boss, the safe house in Mapo is prepared," Jun-il said, his voice tight with a desperate need for logic. "The security team is on standby. We can drop her there and let the doctor handle the delivery before we hand her over to Seon." "We aren't going to Mapo," Kang-Ryeon replied, his gaze fixed on the blurred lights of the city outside. "Take the private mountain pass. We're going to the estate." The car swerved slightly as Jun-il's foot jerked on the pedal. "The estate? Your home? Boss, that's a breach of every security protocol you ever wrote. Nobody goes there. Not even the inner circle. To bring a high-value target, a woman marked by every broker in the city, to your sanctuary. She isn't a target anymore," Kang-Ryeon interrupted, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that silenced the enforcer. He looked down at Mi-Seon, whose hand was still weakly clutching the lapel of his coat. Her eyes were closed, her face drained of color, but her lips moved in a silent, rhythmic prayer for the child she carried. When the car finally hummed through the iron gates of the secluded estate, the silence of the mountain air felt heavy with the weight of the decision Kang-Ryeon had made. He stepped out into the dying rain, ignoring the umbrella Jun-il attempted to hold over him, and carried Mi-Seon toward the massive oak doors. Inside, the house was a temple of minimalist glass and stone, cold and untouched by the chaos of the world, until now. As Kang-Ryeon laid her down on the pristine white sofa of his private study, the mud from the dock stained the fabric, a physical mark of the rot he had let into his carefully constructed life. Jun-il stood in the doorway, his scarred knuckles twitching. "The men are asking questions, Kang-Ryeon. They saw you point your gun at our own people back at the docks. They saw you protect the asset. If word gets back to the syndicate that you've hidden her in your own bed, it won't just be Seon coming for us. It'll be our own brothers." Kang-Ryeon didn't look back. He was focused on the way Mi-Seon's breathing had slowed, the way her small hand finally relaxed its grip on his coat. "Let them come," he whispered, the words sounding like a vow. "Call Dr. Lim, tell him if he isn't here in 20 minutes, he'll never practice medicine again. And Jun-il, lock the gates. No one enters. No one leaves. This house is no longer a home, it's a fortress." The tires of Dr. Lim Wajin's sedan screeched as it was practically dragged into the estate's driveway by two of Kang-Ryeon's men. Wajin barely had time to kill the engine before the rear door was yanked open and a cold, metallic barrel pressed against the base of his skull. He didn't flinch. At 50, his nerves had been cauterized by years of stitching up bullet holes in back alleys. He assumed it was the usual, a gunshot wound to a high-ranking lieutenant or a botched drug deal, but the frantic energy of the guards told a different story. "Move," the guard hissed. "The boss is waiting. If she dies, you don't leave this mountain." Wajin grabbed his medical bag, his heart sinking at the word she. Kang-Ryeon didn't keep women, and he certainly didn't risk his reputation for them. He was led through the minimalist corridors of the fortress, his footsteps echoing against the marble, until he reached the private study. The air inside was heavy with the scent of rain, expensive cologne, and the metallic tang of blood. Standing by the window was Seo Kang-Ryeon, his silhouette sharp against the glass. He didn't turn around, but his voice was a whip crack in the silence. "Save them, Wajin. Both of them." Wajin hurried to the sofa, expecting to see a femme fatale caught in the crossfire. Instead, he stopped dead. Laying on the pristine white cushions was a girl, hardly more than a child herself, with skin the color of ash and hair matted with mud. Her hand was clamped over her stomach, which was unmistakably, dangerously distended. "She's in premature labor," Wajin whispered, dropping to his knees and snapping open his bag. He checked her pulse, it was thready and racing. "This isn't a gunshot," Kang-Ryeon. This is a medical emergency. She needs a neonatal unit, a sterile environment, and specialized care. I am a butcher for criminals, not an obstetrician. You are the best I have, Kang-Ryeon said, turning around. His eyes were bloodshot, the iron mask finally showing a jagged fissure. The hospitals are watched. The rival brokers have a bounty on her head that would tempt a saint. You will do it here. Wajin looked at the girl, then back at the most feared man in Seoul. He saw the mud on Kang-Ryeon's Italian suit and the way the mob boss's hand was subtly shaking. For 20 years, Wajin had stayed neutral to survive, but as the girl let out a heartbreaking, fragile whimper of, "Please, my baby," he realized that neutrality was no longer an option. "Get me hot water, every clean towel in this house, and tell Junil to start the generator," Wajin commanded, shedding his coat. "And Kang-Ryeon? You better start praying to whatever god you stopped believing in. We're going to need a miracle." The stillness of the mountain estate was shattered by the rhythmic, insistent buzzing of a burner phone on the marble kitchen island. Baek Junil picked it up, his face hardening as he read the encrypted messages flooding the underworld's private channels. The digital wildfire had begun. Across the city, from the smoky VIP lounges of Gangnam to the shadow-drenched warehouses of the docks, a single narrative was being spun with lethal precision. Mi-Seon sat in his high-back leather chair miles away, a glass of vintage scotch in one hand and a tablet in the other. He wasn't a man of the blade, but his words were far sharper. With a few keystrokes, he had drafted a memo to the Council of Elders, the shadowy alliance that kept the peace between Seoul's rival factions. He painted Seo Kang-Ryeon not as a protector of the innocent, but as a man compromised by a fleeting obsession. He used words like instability, emotional rot, and breach of contract. To the syndicate, a boss who could be moved by a woman's tears was a boss who could be moved by anything. "He has kept the asset for himself," Seon whispered into a secure line, his voice smooth and cold as silk. "He fired upon his own brothers to keep the girl. The codes, the leverage, the power, he intends to monopolize it all. Kang-Ryeon isn't just breaking his own rules, he's planning to break our alliance. Is a man that erratic fit to lead the North Sector?" Back at the estate, Junil burst into the study, the light from his phone screen reflecting in his panicked eyes. "Boss, Seon is moving faster than we anticipated. He's leaked the dockside footage, selectively edited. It looks like you've betrayed the syndicate for a payout. The other brokers are pulling their support. By morning, the council will likely issue a removal order. Even our own men are starting to hesitate at the gates." Kang-Ryeon didn't look up from where he stood near the doctor, his eyes fixed on the pale, sweating face of Mi-Seon. The iron rule had been a wall that protected him, but Seon was now using that same wall to entomb him. He knew that in the eyes of his world, he had become the very thing he despised, an emotional liability. "Let him talk," Kang-Ryeon said, his voice a low, terrifying vibration. "Seon thinks he's destroying my reputation. He doesn't realize he's just freeing me from the constraints of having one. If they want a monster who doesn't follow the rules, I will show them exactly what that looks like. Tell the men at the gate that if they want to join Seon, they should leave now. Because anyone who stays is officially at war with the world." The scream that tore from Mi-Seon's throat was no longer a plea, it was a raw, primal sound of a body pushed to its absolute limit. Inside the dimly lit study, the air was suffocatingly hot, thick with the scent of antiseptic and the heavy, metallic tang of fear. Dr. Wajin's hands were stained red as he shouted instructions over the rising wind outside. Mi-Seon's body racked with a violent contraction, her fingers digging into the velvet sofa until the fabric shredded. "She's crowning, Kang-Ryeon. I need you to hold her steady." Wajin barked, his usual fatigue replaced by a desperate, frantic energy. Kang-Ryeon stepped forward, abandoning his post by the window. He took Mi-Seon's hand in his, the same hand that had crushed windpipes and signed death warrants, and let her grip it with a strength born of pure agony. He didn't flinch as her nails drew blood from his palm. For a moment, the world narrowed down to the rhythm of her shallow breaths and the life-or-death struggle occurring on his furniture. Then, the silence of the mountain was shattered by the sharp, rhythmic pop-pop-pop of suppressed gunfire hitting the reinforced glass downstairs. The house groaned as the first floor's security perimeter was breached. Outside, the flash of muzzle flares illuminated the rain, revealing a swarm of shadows moving with professional precision, Seon's elite eraser squad. They weren't there to negotiate, they were there to liquidate the asset and the traitor who held her. Junel. Kang-Ryeon roared, his voice cutting through Mi-Seon's moans. The enforcer appeared in the doorway, his tactical vest buckled and an assault rifle held tight against his shoulder. They've cut the main power, boss. We're on the backup generator, but they're already through the foyer. Seon sent the whole damn army. Hold the stairs, Kang-Ryeon commanded, his eyes never leaving Mi-Seon's pale, sweat-slicked face. Kill anyone who touches the first step. If a single bullet enters this room, I'll have your head. Junel nodded, a grim, terrifying smile touching his scarred lips. He vanished into the hallway, followed by the deafening roar of a shotgun blast that shook the chandeliers. Downstairs, the house became a slaughterhouse, the sound of breaking glass and dying men forming a horrific lullaby. Inside the study, Mi-Seon gave one final, earth-shattering cry. The sound of gunfire seemed to fade as Dr. Wajin reached out, his face illuminated by the flickering emergency lights. One more push, Mi-Seon. Focus on me, not the noise. Give me the baby. Kang-Ryeon leaned in, his forehead pressing against hers, his cold world finally burning down around him as the first thin, fragile wail of a newborn rose to meet the sound of the war outside. The thin, wavering cry of the newborn was a fragile thread of hope in a room drowning in the chaos of war. But as Dr. Wajin cradled the infant, his face went deathly pale. She's hemorrhaging, Kang-Ryeon. The stress, the trauma, the placenta won't detach. If I don't stop the bleeding now, she won't make it to sunrise. Outside the study door, the thunder of the siege intensified. A concussive blast rocked the hallway, followed by the jagged scream of tearing metal. The eraser squad had breached the upper landing. Junel's voice rose over the cacophony, strained and desperate. Boss. They've got high-caliber rounds. We're being pushed back into the wing. You have to move her now. Kang-Ryeon looked from the infant to Mi-Seon, whose eyes were fluttering, her grip on his hand slipping as she drifted toward a gray abyss. If they moved her, she would bleed out. If they stayed, the assassins would finish what the labor started. Don't move her, Kang-Ryeon commanded, his voice a low, terrifying anchor in the storm. He stood up, slowly shedding his blood-stained overcoat. He reached into the hidden holster at the small of his back and pulled a second sleek, black handgun. What are you doing? Wajin gasped, his hands occupied with the pressure pads. Buying you time, Kang-Ryeon replied. He looked at Mi-Seon one last time, not as a target, not as leverage, but as the woman who had forced him to remember his own soul. He leaned down, pressing a ghost of a kiss to her sweat-soaked forehead. Live, Mi-Seon. That is my final rule. He stepped out into the hallway, a shadow entering a furnace. The air was thick with drywall dust and the acrid sting of gunpowder. Junel was pinned behind a fallen marble statue, his shoulder bleeding. 3 assassins in tactical gear were advancing down the corridor, their muzzles flashing in the strobing emergency lights. Kang-Ryeon didn't take cover. He moved with a cold, predatory grace, his weapons barking in rhythmic succession. He was a whirlwind of precision, dropping the first 2 men before they could adjust their aim. But as the 3rd assassin went down, a hidden marksman at the far end of the gallery fired. The impact spun Kang-Ryeon around. A high-velocity round tore through his side, the heat of it searing through his ribs, the exact spot where he had intended for Mi-Seon to be struck by the world's cruelty. He slumped against the wall, the white marble staining a deep, vibrant crimson. Pain flared, white and blinding, but he didn't fall. He forced his leaden legs to hold, his finger tightening on the trigger as more shadows emerged from the stairwell. He was the glacier of Seoul, and if he had to melt to keep this one room warm, he would. He stood his ground in the red haze, a dying king protecting a new life, refusing to let the darkness pass. The acrid stench of cordite filled the corridor, mingling with the copper tang of blood. Baek Jun-il ducked behind the remains of a shattered mahogany pedestal, his chest heaving. Through the haze of drywall dust, he watched a sight that defied every logic he had lived by for 15 years. Seo Kang-Ryeon, the man who had taught him that mercy was a luxury for the dead, was standing in the open, his white shirt blooming with a jagged, crimson stain. The boss was taking fire, not for territory, not for gold, but for a woman whose name he hadn't known 48 hours ago. Jun-il's hand tightened on the grip of his tactical rifle. In his pocket, his own phone vibrated with a relentless frequency. He didn't need to look at the screen to know it was Seon or perhaps even one of the syndicate elders. The messages would be simple: deliver the girl, eliminate the compromised boss, and you inherit the North Sector. It was the ultimate promotion, the logical conclusion to a life spent in the shadows. He looked at Kang-Ryeon's back. The boss was slowing, his movements hindered by the hole in his side, yet he continued to fire with a lethal, rhythmic persistence that kept the hallway clear. He was a dying sun, and Jun-il was the shadow that had always followed him. A fresh squad of Seon's erasers rounded the corner, their laser sights dancing across the smoke. One red dot settled squarely on the back of Kang-Ryeon's head. This was the moment of the dilemma. If Jun-il stayed silent, the syndicate would be restored to its cold, efficient order. The rules would be upheld. The liability would be removed. He looked at the study door behind Kang-Ryeon, where the faint, intermittent cry of the infant rose above the gunfire. That sound was a foreign frequency in their world of screams and silences. It was the sound of something that hadn't been corrupted yet. Jun-il. Kang-Ryeon's voice was a ragged growl, his strength flagging as he slumped further against the doorframe. Get the doctor and the girl through the service elevator. Now. Jun-il looked at the laser sight hovering near his boss's temple. He looked at the bloody handprint Kang-Ryeon had left on the wall, a mark of a man who had finally found something worth dying for. With a guttural roar, Jun-il didn't turn his gun on the boss. Instead, he swung his rifle toward the end of the hall, his muzzle flare illuminating the dust as he tore through the assassins. He stepped out of cover, positioning his own body as a secondary shield in front of Kang-Ryeon. I'm not leaving, boss, Jun-il gritted out, his scarred knuckles white as he hammered the trigger. If we're going to hell for breaking the rules, we might as well go together. Loyalty, for the first time in his life, wasn't about a contract or a code. It was about the man who was currently bleeding out to save a life that meant nothing to the world, but everything to his soul. The shadow had decided, it would burn with the sun. The transition from the mountain estate to the private clinic was a blur of high-speed maneuvers and desperate medical stabilization. Dr. Wajin worked in the back of the moving van, his hands shaking as he monitored Mi-Seon's fading pulse, while Kang-Ryeon sat upright by the door, a makeshift bandage soaked through with his own blood. They reached the clinic, a sterile, underground facility owned by the syndicate, just as the first of Seon's scout vehicles crested the horizon. The clinic was supposed to be a safe zone, but the iron rule had been dismantled, and the scent of betrayal followed them like a shadow. As the heavy blast doors hissed shut, the sound of an explosion rocked the street level above. The siege had followed them. Seon was no longer hiding behind digital smear campaigns, he was burning the city down to prove that mercy had a body count. Inside the neon-lit hallway, the air was cold and smelled of ozone. Mi-Seon was rushed into a surgical suite, her hand finally slipping away from Kang-Ryeon's as the doors swung closed. He stood in the corridor, leaning heavily against the wall, his breath hitching in his chest. Jun-il stood beside him, checking the magazine of his rifle, his face a mask of grim determination. "They're coming through the ventilation and the service lift," Junil reported, his eyes scanning the security monitors. "Seon has hired mercenaries. They don't care about the asset anymore, boss. They've been ordered to level the building." Kang-Ryeon looked at the closed door of the surgical suite. Inside was a woman he had been ordered to kill and a child who shouldn't have been born into this world of ash. He forced himself upright, the pain in his side a white-hot reminder of his mortality. He took a heavy combat shotgun from the wall rack, the metal cold and unforgiving against his palm. "Then we make this their graveyard," Kang-Ryeon said, his voice a lethal rasp. The lights flickered and died as the mercenaries cut the main breakers. In the sudden, oppressive darkness, the red emergency lights pulsed like a dying heart. The elevator doors at the end of the hall groaned, forced open by hydraulic jacks. Shadows poured out, their night vision goggles glowing like the eyes of demons. Kang-Ryeon didn't wait. He stepped into the center of the hall, the silhouette of a man who had already accepted his end. He opened fire, the thunderous roar of the shotgun drowning out the rhythmic beep of the heart monitors behind him. Every shell he spent was a second bought for the life behind the door. He was no longer a boss or a businessman, he was a wall of flesh and fire, standing in the gap between the innocent and the monsters he had once called brothers. The hospital was no longer a place of healing, it was a fortress of final stands. The smoke in the clinic's main corridor was so thick it swallowed the light from the strobing red emergency lamps. Through the haze, a figure emerged with the calculated elegance of a predator entering a cage. Mi-Seon walked over the bodies of his fallen mercenaries, his silk suit pristine, his expression one of amused disappointment. He stopped 10 paces from where Kang-Ryeon sat slumped against the surgical ward doors, a shotgun across his lap and a jagged hole in his side. "Look at you, Kang-Ryeon," Seon said, his voice smooth and mocking. "The great glacier of Seoul, melting in a hallway for a woman who doesn't even know your middle name. You were the gold standard of our world. Now, you're just a cautionary tale about what happens when a monster tries to find a soul." Kang-Ryeon raised his head, his face pale and slick with cold sweat, but his eyes remained sharp enough to cut. He didn't speak. He simply watched as Seon drew a silver-plated pistol. "You broke the code for a feeling," Seon continued, stepping closer. "You traded an empire for a child that will grow up to be nothing. That is the definition of weakness. In 5 minutes, I will walk into that room, finish what the labor started, and take the codes. You died for a mistake. You think mercy is a weakness because you've never seen it used as a blade," Kang-Ryeon finally rasped, his voice a dry rattle. He reached into his pocket, not for a weapon, but for a small, encrypted remote. "You spent so much time mocking my heart that you forgot I still have my head. You followed me here because you thought I was desperate. You forgot I was a strategist." Seon froze as the wall monitors behind him flickered to life, powered by a separate, hidden circuit. They didn't show the hospital. They showed Seon's own private vaults, his offshore accounts, and the faces of his most trusted lieutenants being rounded up by Baek Junil's secondary strike team. "I didn't just bring the girl here to save her," Kang-Ryeon said, a ghost of a smile touching his blood-stained lips. "I brought you here to isolate you. While you were playing soldier, I was erasing your existence. Every broker you turned against me, I bought them back with the very codes you were so desperate to find. I gave them your territory as a down payment for your head." The color drained from Seon's face. He leveled his gun, but his hand was shaking. "You're bluffing. You wouldn't give up that much power for her." "I'd give up the world to see you lose," Kang-Ryeon whispered. "Mercy didn't make me soft, Seon. It made me fearless. I have nothing left to protect but that door, which means I have nothing left to lose." Before Seon could pull the trigger, the muffled sound of a single, precise shot rang out from the ventilation shaft above. Seon collapsed, a neat red bloom appearing on his forehead. Kang-Ryeon didn't look at the body. He looked at the surgical doors as they slowly opened, revealing the first light of a new dawn. The silence that followed the final echo of gunfire was heavy, thick with the scent of spent brass and the fading pulse of adrenaline. Kang-Ryeon remained on the floor, his back against the cold steel of the surgical doors, his breath hitching in shallow, ragged bursts. He closed his eyes, the weight of the world he had just dismantled pressing down on his chest. Seon was dead, his empire a digital ruin, and the syndicate that had once been Kang-Ryeon's entire identity lay in ashes at his feet. He had won, but the cost was carved into his skin in blood and fire. Then, the silence broke. It wasn't a shout or a gunshot, but a sound so thin and fragile it seemed impossible it could exist in such a graveyard. It was the first cry of a newborn child, a sharp, piercing wail that vibrated through the metal doors and into Kang-Ryeon's very bones. It was a sound of pure life, defiant and demanding, echoing through the sterile hallway where so many men had just breathed their last. The doors behind him hissed open. Dr. Wajin stepped out, his surgical mask hanging around his neck, his eyes damp with a fatigue that had finally turned into something resembling peace. In his arms was a small, squirming bundle wrapped in a clean white hospital blanket. "A girl," Wajin whispered, his voice trembling. "She's healthy, Kang-Ryeon. She's a fighter, just like her mother." Kang-Ryeon looked up, his vision blurring. For a man who had spent 40 years looking at the world through a lens of profit and loss, the sight of the infant was a revelation. She was tiny, her face flushed pink and her hands grasping at the air, oblivious to the war that had been fought for her first breath. She was the one thing in his life that hadn't been bought, sold, or stolen. Jun-Il approached from the far end of the hall, his rifle lowered, his face streaked with soot. He stopped beside his boss, looking down at the child with a bewildered kind of awe. The iron rule wasn't just broken, it had been replaced by something far more powerful. The syndicate was gone, their enemies were shadows, and the cold logic of the underworld had been silenced by a single, high-pitched cry. "Mi-Seon?" Kang-Ryeon asked, his voice a ghost of its former self. "Stabilized," the doctor replied, resting a hand on Kang-Ryeon's shoulder. "She's sleeping. She'll wake up in a world where no one is hunting her anymore." Kang-Ryeon reached out a trembling, blood-stained finger, and the infant's hand instinctively curled around it. In that small, firm grip, the boss of Seoul felt the last of his ice melt away. The battle was over, not because he had killed his enemies, but because he had finally found something worth living for. The heavy iron gates of the estate creaked open one last time, cutting through the crisp morning air of the mountains. A sleek, unmarked SUV waited in the driveway, its engine humming a quiet, steady rhythm. Seo Kang-Ryeon stood on the stone steps, his long black coat draped over shoulders that no longer felt the weight of an empire, but the healing sting of a scar. His side ached with every breath, a physical reminder of the night that glacier had finally broken, but his gaze was steady and clear. Baek Jun-Il emerged from the house first, carrying 2 small suitcases with a gentleness that looked foreign on a man of his stature. He loaded them into the vehicle before stepping aside, nodding solemnly to his boss. Behind him came Mi-Seon. She moved slowly, her strength returning, wrapped in a soft cashmere shawl Kang-Ryeon had placed around her shoulders. In her arms, tucked safely against the cold, was the child, the miracle that had survived a war before she could even see the sun. Mi-Seon stopped at the base of the steps, looking up at the man who was supposed to be her executioner. There were no words left to say, the silence between them was filled with the memory of a rain-soaked dock and a bloody hallway. She reached out, her fingers grazing the back of his hand in a silent promise of remembrance. "The documents are in the glove box," Kang-Ryeon said, his voice no longer a rasp of command, but a low, protective hum. "New names, a home by the coast, and a trust that will ensure she never knows the hunger you endured. My men will watch the perimeter from a distance. You are free, Mi-Seon. Truly free. You saved us," she whispered, her eyes shining with a light that outshone the morning sun. "Why? Kang-Ryeon looked at the sleeping infant, then back at the woman who had dared to ask for mercy from a monster. Because you reminded me that I was a man before I was a king, he replied. And a man's worth isn't measured by what he takes, but by what he refuses to let break. He watched as Jun-il closed the door, the glass tinted to hide them from a world that had tried to claim them. As the vehicle began its slow descent down the mountain pass, moving toward a life of anonymity and peace, Kang-Ryeon didn't turn away. He stood as a solitary sentinel against the horizon, a protector whose iron rules had been replaced by a single, unbreakable vow. He was no longer the boss of Seoul's underworld, he was the guardian of a ghost, forever changed by 5 words and a first cry. The man who had forgotten what innocence looked like finally closed his eyes, listening to the wind, and for the first time in 40 years, he felt the warmth of the sun.